I signed the contract on a Tuesday afternoon in May, 3 weeks after graduation, wearing a blazer I'd bought at Target and shoes that pinched my heels. The office smelled like printer toner and stale coffee. My Uncle Marcus shook my hand across a desk cluttered with invoices, his grip firm, his smile wide. "Welcome to the family business, Nadia," he said. "We're so glad you're here." I was 22 years old, carrying $47,000 in student loans, and desperate enough to believe that family meant something other than leverage. What I didn't know then, sitting in that cramped office with the flickering fluorescent lights, was that within 18 months, I would own the one thing they couldn't function without. And they would have no idea until it was far too late. My name is Nadia Chen. I grew up in Sacramento, the middle child in a family that measured worth in quarterly earnings and silence at the dinner table. My father, David, built Chen Logistics from a single delivery van in 1987 into a mid-sized freight brokerage that handled regional distribution for agricultural suppliers across Northern California. By the time I was in high school, the company employed 43 people and grossed $12 million annually. My older brother Kyle was groomed from birth to take over. He had the corner office at 19, the company credit card at 20, and a DUI arrest sealed by my father's lawyer at 22. My younger sister Bree was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, the one who posted Instagram stories from company events while I was studying for organic chemistry midterms alone in my dorm. I was the expendable one. The practical one. The one they called when they needed someone to cover a shift at the warehouse during Christmas break, but never invited to the actual family Christmas dinner at my uncle's estate in Granite Bay. I told myself it didn't matter. I had a degree in supply chain management, a 3.8 GPA, and a plan to work anywhere that wasn't connected to my last name. Then my mother called. It was late April, 2 weeks before finals. Her voice had that practiced sweetness she used when she needed something. "Your Uncle Marcus really wants to bring you on board," she said. "He thinks you'd be perfect for the operations coordinator role. It's entry level, but it's family, Nadia. It's stable." I should have said no. I should have recognized the tone, the timing. The fact that Kyle had just been promoted to Vice President of Client Relations, despite having lost 3 major accounts in 6 months. But I had loans. I had no other offers. And some small, stubborn part of me wanted to prove I could belong. So I signed. The first 3 months were a masterclass in invisibility. I arrived at 7 a.m. an hour before anyone else. I left at 6:30 p.m. after everyone had gone home. I filed shipping manifests, updated inventory logs, reconciled discrepancies between what drivers reported and what clients received. It was grunt work, the kind of thing that keeps a logistics company from hemorrhaging money through inefficiency, but nobody noticed unless it wasn't done. Kyle had the clients. Bree handled marketing, which mostly meant taking photos of trucks and posting them with inspirational quotes about hard work. My father managed finances. My Uncle Marcus ran operations, which meant he delegated everything to me and took credit during quarterly meetings. I didn't complain. I documented. Every invoice that came through the office, I scanned and saved to a personal cloud account. Every vendor contract, every shipping route, every insurance policy. I told myself it was just good practice, a backup in case the company's ancient server finally gave up. But really, I was building a map, a detailed forensic record of how Chen Logistics actually functioned beneath the surface, and what I found was a disaster waiting to collapse. The company had exactly 3 critical vendors. The first was Golden State Warehousing, which provided our primary storage facility in West Sacramento. The second was Apex Freight Solutions, the carrier network that handled our long-haul routes. The third was Integrated Dispatch Systems, the software platform that managed routing, scheduling, and driver communication. All 3 contracts were set to expire within the same 6-month window. And nobody, not my father, not Marcus, not Kyle with his expensive haircut and his motivational speeches, had bothered to renegotiate them. I brought it up once in a Tuesday morning meeting. The conference room was too warm, the air conditioning broken for the third consecutive week. Marcus was scrolling through his phone. Kyle was late. My father sat at the head of the table reading a printout of the previous quarter's revenue. "Excuse me," I said, my voice steady. "I noticed the warehouse lease expires in 4 months. Should I reach out to Golden State to discuss renewal terms?" My father didn't look up. "We've been with them for 15 years. They're not going anywhere. But the contract has an auto-escalation clause," I continued. "If we don't renegotiate before the deadline, rent increases by 18% automatically." Marcus finally glanced up from his phone. "Nadia, we appreciate your diligence, but these relationships are built on trust. We don't need to micromanage every detail." Kyle walked in then, holding a Starbucks cup, his tie loosened. "Are we talking about vendor stuff? God, that's boring. Let's focus on growth, not paperwork." I didn't bring it up again. Instead, I made a decision. If they weren't going to protect the company, I would. Not for them, for me. I started researching corporate structures, LLC formations, acquisition strategies. I had no money, no credit, and no leverage. But I had something they didn't. I understood exactly how fragile their entire operation was. Before you hear what I did next, let me ask you this. Have you ever worked somewhere that treated you like furniture? Like you were only visible when something needed fixing? Drop a comment and let me know, because I'd love to hear I'm not the only one. And if you're getting something out of this story, hit that subscribe button. There's a lot more coming, and I promise it only gets more calculated from here. 3 months after that meeting, I received a severance notice. Not a termination, a severance. The distinction mattered, apparently. For legal reasons Marcus had explained in an email that was CC'd to HR but not to me directly, until I found it in the shared drive by accident. The company was restructuring. My position was being consolidated into Kyle's department. I was offered 2 weeks' pay and a recommendation letter. The letter, which I never asked for and which arrived unsigned, described me as detail-oriented and adequate for entry-level coordination tasks. I read it in my car, parked in the warehouse lot, my hands so still they didn't even shake. I had been there for 14 months. I had saved them an estimated $140,000 in billing errors, reconciliation mistakes, and missed early payment discounts. I had never been late. I had never called in sick. I had worked holidays. And I had been erased. The next morning, I didn't show up to clean out my desk. I sent a one-line email to HR confirming receipt of the severance terms, and then I disappeared. But I didn't stop working. I had been preparing for this moment longer than I realized. 6 months earlier, during one of my late nights in the office, I had noticed something odd. Golden State Warehousing, the company that stored 90% of Chen Logistics inventory, was listed for sale. Not publicly, but buried in a commercial real estate newsletter I subscribed to for industry research. The owner, Ed Castellano, was 73 years old. He had no children interested in the business. He wanted out, but he wanted a buyer who would honor his existing contracts and keep his staff employed. The asking price was $2.3 million. I had $4,800 in my checking account. But I had something better. I had a plan. I spent the next 2 months working 3 jobs. I drove for a rideshare service in the mornings. I did remote data entry for a logistics startup in the afternoons. I bartended on weekends. I lived in a studio apartment in Rancho Cordova with a broken dishwasher and neighbors who fought at 2 a.m. I ate pasta and canned soup. I didn't buy new clothes. I saved every dollar. But more importantly, I called in every favor I had. I reached out to Professor Delgado, my supply chain professor from college, who had once mentioned he invested in small logistics businesses. I contacted 3 former classmates who worked in private equity. I drafted a pitch deck that was 22 slides long and took me 40 hours to perfect. The pitch was simple. Golden State Warehousing was undervalued because Ed Castellano had never modernized. The facility was profitable but outdated. With minimal capital investment, automation upgrades, and better contract management, it could double its revenue within 3 years. And it came with a locked-in anchor tenant, Chen Logistics. What I didn't tell anyone, not the professor, not the investors, not Ed Castellano, was that the moment I owned that warehouse, Chen Logistics would lose the only leverage they had. It took 4 months to close. Professor Delgado brought in 2 angel investors from his network. Together, they funded 60% of the purchase. I borrowed the rest using a small business administration loan, personally guaranteed, with terms that would have made my father weep if he'd ever bothered to teach me about debt. On December 14th, I became the sole managing member of Golden State Properties, LLC. I owned the building. I owned the equipment. I owned the contract that Chen Logistics had taken for granted for 15 years. And they had no idea. I didn't announce it. I didn't send a press release. I didn't change the sign on the building. Ed Castellano's staff stayed on. The operations continued exactly as they had. I paid myself nothing. I reinvested every dollar of profit into equipment upgrades and a quiet rebranding. Then I waited. The lease renewal deadline arrived in February. I sent a standard notification letter, professionally formatted, from Golden State Properties to Chen Logistics' corporate address. It outlined the terms for a new 5-year lease. Rent would increase, not by 18%, but by 35%, reflecting current market rates for climate-controlled industrial space in West Sacramento. The letter also noted that the previous auto-renewal clause had expired and that occupancy beyond March 31st would require a signed agreement. The letter was ignored. I sent a second notice 2 weeks later. Certified mail. Still ignored. On March 15th, I sent a final notice, this one from an attorney. It was polite, formal, and non-negotiable. If Chen Logistics did not execute a new lease by March 28th, they would be required to vacate the premises by April 15th. That got a response. Marcus called me. I was at a coffee shop in Midtown, working on a vendor audit for a consulting client I'd picked up on the side, when my phone buzzed. I didn't recognize the number at first. Then I saw the Sacramento area code and realized it was the office line. I let it go to voicemail. His message was clipped, irritated. Nadia, it's your uncle. We received some kind of legal notice from the warehouse. I think there's been a mix-up. Call me back so we can clear this up. A mix-up. That was the word he used. As if the fact that I now controlled the single most critical asset in their supply chain was a clerical error. I didn't call back. I sent an email. Professional. Detached. It confirmed that Golden State Properties was under new ownership, that the previous terms had expired, and that any questions regarding the lease should be directed to our legal counsel. I CC'd the attorney. 3 days later, my father called. I was in my apartment making dinner, pasta again, when the phone rang. I stared at his name on the screen for a long time before I answered. Nadia. His voice was tight. What the hell is going on? I assume you're referring to the warehouse lease, I said, stirring the pot. My tone as neutral as his was strained. You can't do this. That's our facility. We've been there for 15 years. You've been a tenant there for 15 years, I corrected, and your lease expired. The new terms are market rate. If you'd like to negotiate, I'm happy to schedule a meeting. You don't own that building. I do, actually. I can send you the title deed if you'd like to verify. There was a long silence. I could hear him breathing, the sound of my mother's voice in the background, muffled and sharp. This is unacceptable, he said finally. You're trying to extort your own family. I'm offering a lease renewal at fair market value, I said. If you'd prefer to relocate your inventory, you're welcome to do so. But I'll need written notice by the 28th. I hung up before he could respond. The next morning, Kyle showed up at the warehouse. I wasn't there. I was meeting with a potential new tenant, a regional food distributor who needed cold storage. But my facility manager, a man named Tom who had worked for Ed Castellano for 20 years, called me immediately. There's a guy here, Tom said. Says he's your brother. He's demanding to see the owner. Tell him the owner isn't available, I said, and tell him that unauthorized access to the facility is a security violation. He's yelling. Then call the police. Tom hesitated. You sure? I'm sure. Kyle left before the police arrived, but not before Tom had pulled the security footage. I watched it later that night, sitting in my apartment with the lights off. Kyle, red-faced, pointing at Tom, his mouth moving in exaggerated shapes. Tom, calm, arms crossed, pointing at the exit. I saved the footage. I didn't know if I'd need it, but I saved it. The next week was a cascade. Chen Logistics couldn't relocate their inventory in time. Every comparable facility in the region was either too small, too expensive, or unavailable on short notice. They tried to negotiate. Marcus sent an email offering to pay the 18% increase they'd originally ignored. I declined. My father sent a formal offer, drafted by their attorney, offering a 25% increase and a 10-year commitment. I declined. Bree, of all people, sent me a text. It was the first time she'd contacted me in 8 months. Please don't do this. You're hurting the whole family. I didn't respond. On March 28th, they signed the new lease. Rent increased by 35%. The term was reduced to 3 years, with annual escalation clauses tied to inflation. There was no auto-renewal. And there was one additional clause buried on page 7 that I had insisted on. Any default on payment, any violation of facility rules, any attempt to sublet or transfer the lease without written consent from the owner would result in immediate termination with 0 notice period. I had them, completely, but I wasn't done. 6 weeks later, I received a call from Jeremy Hodge, the CEO of Apex Freight Solutions, the carrier network that handled Chen Logistics' long-haul routes. Apex was a small operation, 23 trucks, all owner-operators who had contracts with Jeremy's company. He'd heard through industry connections that I had recently acquired a warehousing facility. I'm looking to retire, he said over the phone, his voice gravelly from years of smoking. I'm 71, my back's shot. My wife wants to move to Arizona. You interested in buying a freight company? I met him at a diner off I-80 the following Tuesday. He laid out the financials on a laminated placemat next to his coffee cup. Apex grossed $1.8 million annually. It was profitable, barely, but only because Jeremy worked 7 days a week and paid himself almost nothing. Why me? I asked. He shrugged. You're young, you're smart, and word is you just outplayed Chen Logistics on that warehouse deal. I respect that. I bought Apex Freight Solutions for $950,000, financed through seller carryback and another SBA loan that made my previous debt look quaint. The acquisition closed in June. Now I owned the warehouse and the trucks. Chen Logistics, the company that had fired me, that had treated me like a placeholder, that had dismissed every warning I'd given them, was now entirely dependent on 2 businesses I controlled. I still didn't announce it. I still didn't gloat. I rebranded Apex under a holding company name that meant nothing to anyone. I kept the operations seamless. The trucks still ran the same routes. The warehouse still stored the same inventory. And then, in August, I received the call I'd been waiting for. It was Marcus. His voice was different now, smaller. Nadia, he said, we need to talk. About what? I asked. We're having some cash flow issues. Nothing major, just temporary. But we need to renegotiate the terms on the warehouse lease. The lease was signed in March, I said. It's non-negotiable. I know, but... And I'm assuming you're also aware that Apex Freight Solutions was recently acquired. Silence. You own Apex? I do. Jesus Christ. Is there something specific you need, Marcus? I asked. We can't afford both contracts at these rates. You're bleeding us dry. You're paying market rate, I said. If you'd like to find alternative vendors, you're welcome to do so. There are no alternatives. You know that. Then I suppose you'll have to make it work. He hung up. 2 months later, Chen Logistics missed a payment on the warehouse lease. It was 3 days late, which triggered the penalty clause. I didn't waive it. The late fee was 12,000 tons. They paid it. The following month, they missed a payment to Apex. The freight contracts had similar terms. The late fee was $8,000. They paid it. By November, the company was in crisis. Kyle had lost 2 more major clients. Bree's marketing budget had been slashed to zero. My father, who had always prided himself on financial discipline, was taking loans against his personal assets to keep the business afloat. And then, in early December, I received a formal offer. It came through an attorney, not from my father directly. Chen Logistics was willing to sell me a 40% equity stake in the company for $1.5 million. The offer included a board seat and full operational control over logistics and warehousing. It was a surrender, dressed up as a partnership. I declined. Instead, I made a counter-offer. I would purchase 100% of Chen Logistics for $2.8 million, structured as an asset acquisition. My father and Marcus would stay on as consultants for 1 year, with salaries reduced to 60,000 tons annually. Kyle and Bree would be terminated immediately, with severance equivalent to 2 weeks' pay. The same severance I had received. They had 72 hours to respond. On the third day, my father called. It was late, nearly 10 p.m. I was sitting on my apartment balcony, looking out at the lights of the city, when the phone rang. "You win," he said. His voice was hollow. "This was never about winning," I said. "Then what was it about?" I thought about that for a long time. I thought about the 14 months I had spent being invisible. I thought about the severance letter that called me adequate. I thought about every time they had handed me work and taken credit, every time they had excluded me, every time they had made it clear I was tolerated, not valued. It was about making sure I never had to ask for permission again, I said. He didn't respond. The sale closed in January. I took ownership of Chen Logistics on a Thursday afternoon, signing documents in the same office where I had signed my original employment contract 2 years earlier. The room still smelled like printer toner. The fluorescent lights still flickered. But this time, I wasn't desperate. I wasn't expendable. I wasn't the middle child who didn't matter. I was the owner. Kyle and Bree were notified by email. They didn't show up to collect their things. Marcus stayed on for 3 months before he retired to Granite Bay, where he spends his days golfing and pretending he always knew I had it in me. My father worked his full year. He never apologized. But on his last day, as he was packing his office, he stopped at my door. "You didn't have to do it this way," he said. "Yes," I said. "I did. Chen Logistics is still operating. We're more efficient now. I've automated half the processes Kyle used to mismanage. I've renegotiated contracts my father ignored. Revenue is up 22%. Staff turnover is down. And I still get to work at 7 a.m., an hour before everyone else. Not because I have to, because I want to. I'm 24 years old. I own a logistics company, a warehousing facility, and a freight network. I have debt that will take me a decade to pay off. I work 7 days a week, and I wouldn't change a single thing. Because they taught me something valuable even if they didn't mean to. They taught me that the person who controls the foundation controls everything. And I will never, ever give that up again."